We're doing Igros kodesh with Hashem's help. We haven't done Igros kodesh in I don't know how many months. It's been a längere Zeit. Zman oroch b'yoyses. So, I don't know if you want to call this being good or being bad. We're starting on Tov Pei Dalet. This is a letter from the Rebbe to Reb Zusha Vilamovsky in the very beginning of the Nesias. We read more than half of this letter before quarantine. And at the time, I gave you all a bit of history about who Reb Zusha was and the special place he plays in Lubavitch of the Deira Shvi of the 7th generation. Let it suffice to say that number one, he was an incredibly capable Askan Tziburi. He was very, very skilled at making things happen. And number two, he was an incredibly big chassid of the Rebbe. And number three, he was an amazing human being. And these three characteristics made him invaluable, very, very important to Lubavitch. So we're going to read the letter from the beginning again. Okay? I'll give you one piece of background. And again, all of this was discussed before the quarantine. There was a Yid by the name of Harav Shalaber Lifshitz. Harav Shalaber Lifshitz. He was a Bachet learning in Teresemis Netisro. He was a Lubavitcher. He made an organization which is called Ad Etam Hayem Hazeh. It's called Yad La'achim. He's already in Elam HaEmes, but his organization goes on, and the good that it does continues. It's evolved. It's changed over time. The original Yad La'achim was about protecting children coming to Eretz Yisrael from going to Bati Sefer of Shmat, to going to schools where Shem Elekei Yisrael le'yishoma v'le'yizocher Rachmana litzlan. But over the last 70 years, this organization has evolved. One of the things that they were involved with, as I told you, was to go into these tent cities, Ma'avrot, where the many, many thousands of Jewish immigrants who had come to Eretz Yisrael were living until they could find them permanent housing, and tell the parents, warn the parents, that the government had a law that every child has to go to school. And then they came from the Shomer HaTzair, from the Freie schools, and they registered the children. And the Yidden, the Sfardim especially from Taimon, from Yemen and from Morocco, who were very sincere. They couldn't understand the concept of a Yid who wasn't Frum, Bechlal. They certainly could not understand the concept of a Yid who's against Yiddishkeit. Somebody said, you want to sign up a kid to my school? They signed them up. So Shalom Ber Lifshitz was a bacher. Him and a whole bunch of chevra found out about this. They went into these same Avrot and they began to warn the parents not to sign up the children to these schools because they were going to destroy their kids. And that's a whole parsha. But the consequence of this was that there became a need for schools. If you want Yidden to sign, who are Mesartim, traditional Jews, Frum Jews, traditional Jews, to sign up their children from a yeshivas, there has to be a chayv for them to go to, and they didn't exist. So of course, as you'll see in this letter, this was the source of the Reshes, all Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch, the network of schools that have to do with chinuch, that was made by Lubavitch, not for Lubavitcher children, but from children who were from traditional homes, who needed a chinuch, where there would be good choil and good kodesh and so on. That's the introduction. Now let's learn the letter. Baruch Hashem Tazayinel Tavshal Brukul Yok Rabba Chassid Vosik Bechassid Ishrei Lekim Nichba V'Naila Oisek B'Tzarchei Tzibur Be'emuna V'Chalu he's involved in Tzarchei Tzibur, and the Rebbe adds the word Be'emuna. I've told this to you many times that within a few years the Rebbe stopped using the word Be'emuna altogether. Mareinu Arav Chayim Zusya Sheichi Zusha V'Lamovsky Shalom Abrach. I already received your letters in time of Vov Menachemov, V'Alef Elu, V'hineni ba laha'ir eizin akudas. I want to enlighten, illuminate some points. B'inyanim, in those things, the Rebbe said, I already wrote you about certain things, and I want to clarify more what I meant. That there should not be confusion. And most importantly, there shouldn't be an overlap, an entanglement between himself and other people who are involved in other fields within the arena of kodesh Rabbi. The Rebbe was trying to build Lubavitch, and he wasn't trying to build Lubavitch. He was trying to save the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael from Shmad right after the Holocaust. And his army was a kodesh Chabad, was a Nash, was Lubavitch Hasidim. A kodesh Chabad was small. Their mentality, their brain size, their hashkafa and askanas was even smaller. And there were a few leaders. And of course, anytime someone came along with a new idea, there was a sense of being threatened. You're trying to take my position, you're trying to step on my toes, and so on. So it was very, very important for the Rebbe to establish clear lines. This is you and this is you. In other words, how far apart? I'll give you an example from animals. By animals, lahav, there's something called critical space. If you get too close to an animal, it gets upset. If you stand 1 foot further away, it doesn't get upset. Why? Because every animal has a sense of the area around him that's his. If you don't step into his critical area, it doesn't bother him. Human beings have seichel. Because human beings have seichel, they can override that tendency. How come people could live, human beings, live in greater concentrations than lahav any animal? We live closer to each other in cities like Manhattan and Mexico City and Hong Kong. People live so close to each other because human beings have enough seichel to understand that even if we live near each other, this is my space, this is your space. Animals need to have physical area to assert that. Human beings have seichel. So the Rebbe want to establish lines. Ad kam tchumi shel zeh, mikan ve'el tchumi shel zeh. The lines are very close to each other, but that Hasidim should know, every shliach, everyone involved in kodesh Chabad should know exactly where his line ends and the other person's line begins. So the Rebbe says, I want to therefore speak further to things that I already told you about, to prevent this overlap and then the consequences of this overlap from taking place. Aleph, move on meyat. I'm not taking back what I said. It's self-understood. When I wrote you my earlier letter, in inspiring askonas tziburis, lenatlas kechesa, to use your faculties, your koiches, b'dalad amas shalom, when our dalad amas, says the Rebbe Hoysa Kavanasi, my intention was lahagdiles ha'avodah, to make the word bigger, not smaller, b'chol miktayes efsharim, in all imaginable, in all possible ways. However, mebli livgeya yedezeh, without touching through this, bekveidei shel acher, the covered of somebody else, v'gam shalaiti yakfila ba'aveda, and there shouldn't be also a duplication of work. B'mokem shadai b'yechad. If there's a job that can be done by one, it shouldn't be done by two. So on the one hand, I don't want two jobs to be competed with, two people to be competing for one job. On the other one, I don't want two jobs to be competed for by one person. Everybody should have their job in their space. And therefore the Rebbe says, I want to explain to you how I envisage the Reshes. Now I have to be candid with you. It's very, very difficult to understand the Tzimtzum and Lubavitch that was then. You're talking 69 years ago, almost. And this Tzimtzum created a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear, a lot of distrust. The Rebbe is pushing Lubavitch to establish itself on 1,000 fronts, with no people and no money and no vision, but to find them in the Weltif, to bring Mashiach. And in the early years, the Rebbe pushed Yisrael especially in a crazy way. And the Rebbe gave Klolim how he wanted it to work. They could have worked if every single person involved would have been a Beinani, not even a Tzaddik, just a Beinani, with full control over the Yetzer Hara and a full Mavet, Al Midosav. It could have all worked, but unfortunately people have egos and they get involved. So the Rebbe says, I want to say this, page Tov Pei Dalet, the paragraph that begins with Beis. She'inyan HaReshes, the Ola Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. The idea of the Reshes Ola Yitzchak, the network of schools, the word Reshes means a web, a network of schools that were established not for Lubavitcher children who want Chinuch Altaras HaKedesh, but for children who need to have, I don't know what they call it, Amami Misarti, I don't know what word they use, it has to be Chayil and Kodesh, in a way that they're going to prepare them for life in quotations, but at the same time they should also be Kodesh. Mekoyme its place, but Oisan Ha'arim, in such cities, She'ein Sham Temche Tmimim Achay Tmimim Okei. Don't go to a city where there's already a yeshiva for regular anash and make a school for the Reshes. Even though you're trying to reach different groups of people, but it could become a problem. Go to places in Eretz Yisrael where there is no Temche Tmimim Achay Tmimim, and there you should make a school, all the Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. Oigam B'Mekeimei say, moreover, in these places, Avo Ben Chugim Kela, in such groups, She'ein Sevlem Adayin, that are not yet ready. She'isnagu Beruchish of Temchet Mimim, that people should behave in the spirit of Temchet Mimim. Hainu, this means, believe with Chasidus B'chol Yom, learning Chasidus every day B'cholu. V'kivan She'ein Nikra HaMeised B'Shem Temchet Mimim, and if the school is not called by the name Temchet Mimim, Ozai Ein Zem Muchrach, it's not necessarily going to create a problem. And Kedai, it's therefore appropriate Liyasid Moised to establish a school. She kones Lereshes Ola Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch going to this umbrella. In other words, like this: the emissaries go to places there's no Temchet Mimim, and even if you go to a place where there is a Temchet Mimim or an Achet Mimim, don't appeal to those children. Don't appeal to those families who have an interest in the ruach of Temchet Mimim, which is to learn Chasidus every day. Reach out to the children whose homes are not ready for this yet, and incorporate them into the Reshes. Ha'ora. Note. Ha'mizboinen b'puleiseim shel kedushas admor. If you'll look at the activities of the Frierdiker Rebbe. V'shel aviv kvei kedushas marshab. Zitzuk len gam ziyat. And the conduct of his father, the Rebbe Rashab. Hine yira b'hizbonemus. You'll see if you'll think about it. Sheba b'sha'ah. The truth is, Shadmor marshab, the Rebbe Rashab, hine. When the Rebbe Rashab involved himself in chinuch, his primary occupation was beina chasidim. His primary occupation was amongst chasidim. Hare, emphasis. He trotted out new pathways in the field of chinuch, which is beina chugim, hayeser, rechav, mishalamenu, amongst the broadest groups of our people. Meaning to say that, B'chlal, the Lubavitcher Rebbeim were always involved in askonos. They always were. But in terms of chinuch, says the Rebbe Rashab concerned himself with chassidim. Chassidish children, chassidish families, chassidish cities, chassidish chinuch. What was happening beyond the parameters of the chassidic community, the Rebbe Rashab didn't involve himself directly. I'm not going to say he didn't consider it his business, but I am going to say he didn't involve himself directly. And the Havana is, the Pshat is, that he trusted that other people will do it. The Frierdiker Rebbe came after the first Mabul, and then he came after the second Mabul. The first Mabul is World War I and the Communist Revolution. The second Mabul is the Holocaust, the Shoya Ha'umlola, Rahman al-Tzan Ha'ilesi. And the Rebbe realized that the whole world is his field of work. So the Frierdiker Rebbe involved himself in chinuch of Yidden all over the world. And therefore he created schools that were not necessarily in the full madrege of Temchet Mimim, because he wanted to reach the whole world. So the Rebbe says to make two separate networks. A network which is called Reshes Ola Yosef Yitzchak, and separately Temchet Mimim and Achet Mimim. Let's read on. Behesem now, bottom of page top it down. According to what I just said, it's therefore most appropriate. You should talk, says the Rebbe to Zusher, be'efan amatim, in a way which is appropriate, im hanholos aguch, with the leadership of Agudas Chassidic Chabad, ulazbiram, and explain to them that Zusha Vilimovsky founded the Reshes Ola Yosef Yitzchak. He founded the Moistis Reshes Ola Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch. After a while, I don't know why, but the leadership of the Reshes was taken from Zusha, Reb Zusha, and it was given to one of the tzaddikim of our generation, a yid by the name of Reb David Chanzin. Reb David Chanzin managed the Reshes for 40 years, I think, forever. And the story of his life is a story of unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. Reb David Chanzin's life. He was a dedicated soldier of the Rebbe till Mesiras Nefesh and beyond. Reb Zusha went on to do other things. Reb Zusha remained always involved in the Reshes, so to speak, from the side, but the official management of the Reshes became Reb David. But Reb Zusha founded it. So the Rebbe says, go to the people who are in charge of the other Moist and explain to them top of page, top page, that you're not stepping on their toes. You have no intentions of crossing over to Teim Chatmim and Achetmim. The work that you're going to do is like be'esan mekemis in such places. She'ein yeshivas hanal sham, where there is no Teim Chatmim. Or be'esan machugim, even in those places where there is Teim Chatmim, but amongst those people, she'ein hayeshivas hanal, or yeshivas teiras emes, that the yeshivas of Teim Chatmim or Achetmim or teiras emes, the yecheles likonis l'sham, not every child, not every home, not every family is prepared to give its child to learn the Teim Chatmim or Achetmim. So you should make a Moiset Chinuch which will suit for those children. Tikvasi, says the Rebbe, I hope. Shalpi Hanal, based on what I just said, Hine Mechad Gis on the one hand, Yuchalavid Avedose Atzibur is Ba'amde Bekish Yosher Imad. The Rebbe says to Zusha, I want to be directly in touch with you. Everything you do comes straight to me. I want you to be communicating directly with New York, directly with the Rebbe. Umeidach Gis, and at the same time, it should be in concert. It shouldn't be a contradiction to the work of a Gedulas Chassidei Chabad in general, and to the yeshivas Teim Chatmim and Teiras Emes in particular. Meaning to say, the Rebbe says, I'm dividing up the arena. I'm dividing up the field into sections. Teim Chatmim and Achetmim has its shlichus, has its inyan, and has its place, and has its work, and v'chuli, v'chuli, v'chuli. And they'll do their thing. Resha Solo Yezid Yitzchak Lubavitch has its place and its inyan. If you can establish, and people should believe you and trust you, that you're not stepping on anybody's toes, because you're involved in something different, they'll do the work of Teim Chatmim, you'll do the work of the Reshes, and there won't be any conflict. So the Rebbe says, on the one hand, you're going to be cooperating with Aguch, because you're not going to be interfering with the work that Aguch is doing. But on the other hand, you're going to be working directly with me. The Rebbe says to Zusha, I love these words. Your public service should be done with a direct connection to me. The Rebbe says, I want you to reach out to me. I want you to talk to me. I'll give you direction going forward in terms of Askanas Tziburis. And the truth needs to be said, I always say it, that the Rebbe wrote to Reb Zusha. He writes to him in a letter. Lubavitch has a shortage of Zushas. The Rebbe says to him, Lubavitch doesn't have enough people like you, who have those skills, the chushim of Askanas. Ubemel, it's very, very important that you should work, as the Rebbe calls it, Bekerem Chabad. Okay. Now, does anybody want to say anything or ask any questions, or we're going to move forward? The Rebbe wanted to create schools for children whose homes were not prepared to tolerate Teim Chatmim. He wanted to create schools where kids are going to go to school, learn a half a day kodesh, a half a day chayil, whatever the arrangements would be, recognized by the government, with government support, but they would learn about the Eibishter, and Moshe Rabbeinu, and Avraham Avinu, and Teresh B'Ksav, all the things that in the secular schools in Israel, they don't get at all. Rachmana litzlan. And Reb Zusha was put in charge, it was his idea. Reb Zusha was planning to do it outside the Gevulim of Lubavitch. And the Rebbe Pashat asked him. He wrote to the Rebbe that he's going to do it outside the Gevulim of Lubavitch. And the Rebbe said, no, do it inside the Gevulim of Lubavitch. So rather it became a sichsuch. It looked like he's making another school, it's competing with the Lubavitcher school. So the Rebbe said, no, you're appealing to a different target group. Verstehst? One of the people who was very strongly involved in the Reshus was Rabbi Aaron Mordechai Zilberstrom. He worked in the Reshus his whole life. Rabbi Aaron Mordechai Zilberstrom, who was a very, very special man, a very, very unusual Jew. He met the Rebbe in Paris and he became a Lubavitcher. He met the Rebbe personally in Paris and he developed a kesher with the Rebbe, a personal kesher with the Rebbe. So he got involved in the Reshus. And there was times that in the Reshus there was no money. There was pushing like a geld. And Rabbi Mordechai Zilberstrom's family was starving, Pashut. And the Rebbe writes a letter to him that somebody told me he went into your home and he opened up your refrigerator and your refrigerator was empty. And the Rebbe writes to him, Sind wenn is das an Hog, it's the vision gute Freund. The Rebbe writes to him, since when is the way two friends behave? Friends share things. The Rebbe writes to him, we're friends. A friend needs help, you ask your friend, you don't keep it a secret from him. The Rebbe had a taina to him. How come he didn't tell him that he doesn't have chayoyne? Because the Reshus went through periods of time when there was not enough parnasa. It was up and down and up. It's very hard work to support all those schools and to raise all the money and to pay all the teachers. V'chuli, v'chuli. Anyway, so let's read on. Okay, let's read on. Hey, kivan shala'es ata. At the moment, eina dayin dayim tsoyim. There are not sufficient resources litpatchus gedei l'beyesa to expand this greatly. In other words, there wasn't enough money to make this on the fanem that the Rebbe had, and I guess you could even say the fanem that Zusha had. Page Tov Pei Hey, Sif Hey. Kedai, says the Rebbe, when you start, start slowly, from light to heavy, from small to big, and automatically the chishas moisid, the acquiring of a moisid, of a building, take of miyad, that will require immediately. Larech magbis, to raise money, l'shalom chayves, to pay debts, v'chuli, v'chuli. That doesn't make sense for you to do this right now. In other words, the Rebbe says now, start small, do it in such a way where there's not a lot of overhead. And I guess he meant don't buy buildings, rent buildings, don't rent buildings, use shuls. Find ways of launching the Reshes in a way that's relatively speaking inexpensive, ubefrat, and specifically shesh lekaves, that it's reasonable to assume and to hope shebemeshach hazman, that as time passes, so then when you later buy a building, or whatever the case is, it'll be bitnoyim neichim yes, it'll be easier conditions. I guess he's talking about mortgage rates and other things, me'asher ata, from the way it is now. So the Rebbe says, take it slow. You're starting off the Reshus, take it slow. And of course, there's two sides to this, take it slow. On the one hand, the Rebbe wants it to happen. On the other hand, I mean, I see this on every word, on every page, on every letter of all the Rebbe's Torah is urgency. The now versus the tomorrow. In every field, the Rebbe is so concerned about things happening today and not waiting till tomorrow. It's mind-boggling. The need for today. Hayoim, achshav, not to wait till tomorrow, is the urgency of it is mamish unbelievable. It's mamish unbelievable. But the Rebbe at the same time is practical. So there's a little bit of reason, a little bit of down-to-earthness. There's no such word, but it serves the purpose in the Rebbe's thinking. But in a minute, he's already rushing, you know. The Rebbe says, start slow, start without overhead, start with few expenses so that you can get your feet wet. And the Rebbe says, first of all, later on it'll be easier to expand. And later on it'll be easier to establish yourself. In other words, the Rebbe seems to be speaking about the acquiring of property that right now would have been very difficult and very expensive and a lot of overhead and so on. Vav, behetem lahana, as we discussed above, ashereshes hamois all the Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch, that this network of schools, all the Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch, einok shurim betachnis midukdoka, is not connected with a precise tachnit, I mean the precise, what is the word they use it, a lesson plan or a program. The moist is temchet mimim and so forth. And therefore into the Reshus, into this network of schools, go all kinds of areas associated with chinuch. Ubavachi Altaras HaKodesh, as long as it'll be Altaras HaKodesh. So the Rebbe says, you're making a network of schools for children who can't go to Taim Chetmim. We're not in that level. So the Rebbe says, you're not bound by the strict restrictions of how Taim Chetmim has to be. Hine Pshit, it's understood. Shebetachnes Resha said that in your network of schools, Nichnas Gamkein, it should include also Limud LeTalmidim, place for students to learn, Hamevakre Bate Sefer Acher, they're visiting other schools. You shouldn't have a strict policy, either Taim Chetmimim or not Taim Chetmimim. If a kid goes to a different school, he wants to visit your schools, Adarabah. That's what you're there for. If you can help a child who's learning in a school where there's even less Yiddishkeit, where there's no Ta'ara, there's no Kedusha, and you can raise him, that's how you should do it. Aval yesh lakavis, we can hope. Shayadei eze shoyas sheyilmedu b'reshteinu, they'll learn a little bit by us. Yishtanam and akotza, they'll change from one extreme to the other, b'negei le'yiras shamayim, about fear of God, v'yediyah and knowledge al dvar ha-chasidus, about the concept that there is chasidus, v'chuli. So the Rebbe says you have to, so to speak, be liberal, open-minded. I saw a letter from the Rebbe. We probably didn't read it yet, and if we didn't read it, we're going to read it soon. To the Neshei Chabad. The Rebbe made Agudas Neshei of Nes Chabad. The Rebbe made, I told you, the two big organizations that the Lubavitcher Rebbe made is Tzidei Agudas Chabad, the organization for young leaders, and Agudas Neshei of Nes Chabad. Those are the two big organizations that the Rebbe established, because he was not really establishing organizations, he was establishing new definitions of leadership. The Rebbe was. And in the letters to the Neshei Chabad, there's letters where he explains why he's making the Igud and what is their mission. L'gabe Pnim, l'gabe Chutz, for the Anash, for the women of Anash for themselves, for the women of Anash to be Makad of others. And then the Rebbe writes, the policy of the Igud should be that becoming a member should be as easy as possible. Becoming a member should be as easy as possible, because your role is to have as many women as possible. So the Rebbe says to Zusha the same idea, that Reshes Ol Yosef Yitzchak Lubavitch is not like Taim Chetmim, it's not so rigid in its definition, and therefore it shouldn't be so rigid in how open it is to allowing others to join. Daiti Bekolos, my opinion in general is, Shegamim Yesh Befshar Yusei Larech Magbiyes, Vilesei Schumim Nechenim, that you are in a position to already make fundraisers and to collect substantial amounts of money. Tzarech L'Sader HaMagbiyes, you have to arrange these fundraisers, but in such a way, fundraising is a very sensitive area, because the bottom line is, however you want to say it, I mean, it's a fact of life. Nothing can happen without money. And the Rebbe, even though the Rebbe makes believe he doesn't understand money, he understands money very well. But he also understands fundraising very well. The Rebbe used to say to people, someone said to the Rebbe that there's no money for for a certain Indian. And the Rebbe said, you're telling me that in a city like New York you can't find money for this? Meaning to say, there's so many people who have money, who want to give tzedakah. You go find them. You're telling me in a city like New York you can't find money for this? In other words, when the Rebbe gave a shliach a job, the Rebbe was very understanding of the challenges, but he also understood the realities. And the Rebbe is saying, fundraising is a very sensitive issue. It's the most sensitive issue. I mean, the greatest area where machlekes develops amongst all Askanei Tzibur, including within Lubavitch itself, is when it comes to the overlap of my balabas, your balabas, my gvir, your gvir. So the Rebbe says to Zusha, you're going to raise money, it's a good idea, very important, but don't do it in a way that's stepping on other people's toes. Figure out how to make it amicable. Work with others. Ches. About your question to which zedem, to which stream to belong. This is so sweet. The next 3 lines is a piece of Lubavitcher Rebbe choreography that only the Lubavitcher Rebbe could dance. Oh, nobody else but the Rebbe could dance to this dance. In Israel, I don't understand Israeli Bichlal. I don't know anything. I know a little bit of Hasidus, and that's it. I don't know Israeli politics. I don't understand the Israeli school system. I've never been to Israel. I don't understand it. I'm not an Israeli, and on and on and on. And I'm not a yenta. I'm not one of those people who know stuff. I'm not that kind of person. But from what I understand, in spite of my ignorance, if you wanted to make a school that should be recognized by the government and supported by the government, there were 2 basic zramim, 2 basic streams. There was the Shomer Hatzir, the secular Israeli school system, which the government sponsored and supported. And then there was, I think what you would call the Mizrahi. Dati Lumi, I think Dati Lumi or something like that. It's nationalistic and religious. It's a combination of state and religion together. The Rebbe wanted to make schools. So Zvisher writes to the Rebbe, so what does it belong to? Does it belong to Shemin HaTzar? Does it belong to the Mizrahi? Where do we put these schools? And by the way, there's something called Chinuch Atzmoi in Eretz Yisrael. There's a whole network of schools. Chinuch Atzmoi means Chinuch, Moises Chinuch, that don't take money from the government. This is all the very from people. The whole Aguda is Chinuch Atzmoi. Anyway, so Zushe asks the Rebbe, so to which Zerem do we belong? So the Rebbe answers them like this: Al Sheilosei b'negei la'azramim. Your question about the streams, in other words, you have to belong to a Zerem. Hine kivin she'ad ata. Whereas until now, meistes anash mekablim tmicha mizerem anikra bein azramim. So far, the government is supporting us, and the government is supporting us without us having to join this political faction or this political faction. Not the Shomer HaTzair, and not, again, I think it's called Dati Lumi, but I don't know, the Mizrahi kinds of schools. So let's stay that way. Walk between the raindrops. What Lashon? Zerem anikra bein azram. Hainu bilti maflagusi, it's non-political. Harizeh eifen matam b'yesasat. At least in the meantime it should stay this way. It's still this way ad hayom hazeh. I've told this to you so many times. The positions that the Rebbe took about Israel and Lubavitch are so bold, and they're so that only a Rebbe can have that kind of koyach hamanateach, that ability to discern, to do fine surgery. Lubavitch is involved in the Israeli political system. The Rebbe wrote many, many letters saying that not one vote is allowed to be wasted. Every Jew must vote. Every Yid must vote. Every Lubavitcher must vote. The position of the Rebbe was they should vote for the frumest party, which Bepashas is kodesh Yisrael. But we didn't sit in the Knesset. The Rebbe did not want Lubavitch to join, not to create a political party which is unique to Chabad, and not to create a political party, to join a political party even of the most Haredi Jews. The frumest Jews in Israel are kodesh Yisrael. I should say that again. The frumest Jews in Israel who get involved in the Israeli political system is a good. There's a whole movement of Yidden in Eretz Yisrael, what's called Eidah HaCharedis, who refuse to get involved in Israeli politics. It's a whole story. The Rabbi used to write to them that they drink Israeli water and that they use Israeli electricity. But this is not for today. But the frumest group of Jews who are involved in Israeli politics was the Agudah. The Rebbe did not want the Lubavitch to join the Agudah. He wanted Lubavitch to stay outside of politics for many reasons, and including reasons that the Rebbe, in the Rebbe's words, he was a supporter of Eretz Yisrael, he was not a supporter of Medinas Yisrael. The Rebbe didn't recognize the legitimacy of the nationalist secular state of Israel. Eretz Yisrael. So if you get involved in politics in a way that forces your actions to be interpreted as acknowledging Medinas Yisrael, the Rebbe didn't want that. Realistically, that's impossible. It's so hard to do. You have to be such an action. There's so many forces against you. And he pulled it off. The Rebbe pulled it off. He started from the beginning that way. The Rebbe was very strongly in favor of people voting. And at the same time, he felt that Lubavitch should not be involved in the government directly. They should just support the frumest party and to influence the government and to get help from the government on that basis. Now, anybody who understands politics understands that if you want government money, you have to grease the wheels. If you want the government support, you have to do what the government asks. You have to support. If you don't vote for a political party and then you come with your hand out, they're going to tell you, excuse me, miyata, you didn't vote for me, now you want my support. That's what Lubavitch did and does. And there's all kinds of circumstances. Sometimes the Israeli government gets angry and sometimes they're not so angry. But Lubavitch has established stuff in Eretz Yisrael, believe it or not, as me'alam aflega. We're not involved in politics. We're involved in Yiddishkeit. And a lot of government people, even secular people, recognize this and treat Lubavitch in that spirit and in that light. Okay, I'm going to read one more paragraph and I'm going to stop. In your letter you write about establishing an organization for frum women. To save the youth coming up into Eretz Yisrael. Which was organized 6 months ago. Says the Rebbe, you know for sure, that it's been a while back. Shekasafti Laguch, I wrote to Agudas Chassidei Chabad al Vartachnis about a plan, a program, La'argin Snif Agudas Neshei Chabad, to organize a subgroup of Neshei Chabad. Ukdai Hoya She is Dabari Mohim. It would be appropriate to discuss it with them. Uli La'achad L'shnei Hanyanim Yachad, to join both things together. Now I'm not sure what both things together, whether both things means Agudas Chabad and Agudas Neshei Chabad, or all the Yitzhak Yitzhak Lubavitch and Agudas Neshei Chabad. The bottom line is, at the end of the story will be that Reb Zusha was empowered to start Neshei Chabad. Reb Zusha Vilobovsky started Neshei Chabad. He was still a Bacher. The Rebbe asked him to start Neshei Chabad. Okay, I will see you, Mitzvah Hashem, tomorrow.